Alrighty, welcome everyone. We're just going to take a second to virtually file in before we get started and a few little housekeeping details. So I'll just get started now as we're all filing in, settling down. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Gracie, I'm the events coordinator for print. A few little details before we get started. If you have any questions during the event, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, which is on the bottom right of your screen, or in the question and answer function, which is on the bottom bar of your screen. If you'd like a copy of the Book of Lamps and Banners, I'll include the print link right in the chat box so you can click on through. We have plenty of copies, so you should be able to get your orders right out. I'd also just like to quickly thank Mechanics Hall for their partnership on this event. Though we can't host the event in their beautiful historic library, which you know, is always such a treat. We're so thankful for their partnership and their promotion on this event. And they also, you know, they have a ton of great virtual programming. If you're interested in checking out their programming, I'll include the link to their page as well. And we want to just do a quick special shout out for their event on November 10th with Eddie Escloud Jr. entitled As Much Truth as We Can Bear, James Baldwin in Our America. I'll include the registration link. It's free for members, and I think it's going to be a fantastic night. Alrighty, and now for tonight's author. Elizabeth Hand is the best-selling author of 14 genre-spanning novels and 5 collections of short fiction and essays. Her work has received multiple Shirley Jackson World Fantasy and Nebula Awards, among other honors, and several of her books have been New York Times and Washington Post notable books. Please join me in virtually welcoming Elizabeth Hand.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Gracie. Thank you, Annie. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry we're not all here in the real world, especially on such a slow news day, but I'm delighted to be here in the virtual world. So I'm going to be reading from my new novel, which is The Book of Lamps and Banners. This is the 4th book that I've written to feature Cass Neary. This is a series of noir novels, psychological thrillers, and for those who are unfamiliar with the character, you can pick up this book without having read the previous ones. For those of you who are familiar with her, you will know that she is a middle-aged, aging punk, one-time photographer, basically a troublemaker, alcoholic, has issues with amphetamines, among other things. And she is, as this book opens, in London, where she has sort of been stranded. And she's in search of her ex-con lover, Quinn O'Boyle, who is MIA. And so in the meantime, she's been kind of wandering around the city where she happens to run into an acquaintance named Griffin, who is a character in the first novel, Generation Loss. For those of you who are familiar with that, Griffin is a rare book dealer, bookseller, and he is in London because he is cutting a deal. And he's going to tell us about it and tell Cass about it. And the person who he's cutting the deal with is a book dealer named Harold, who's English. Griffin is American, like Cass. I think that's all you need to know. And the I who is speaking here is Cass Neary. So this is from the Book of Lamps and Banners. We went to a place that Griffin knew, a mid-19th century pub called the Three Balls, now a gastropub. I'd have preferred a dive, but once we were seated, Griffin asked me if I wanted something to drink. What do you want? Single malt, something I can't get at home, a double. I meant to eat. I don't know, whatever. Griffin removed his overcoat and draped it on the back of his chair. He wore a gray herringbone jacket over a blue Oxford cloth shirt. When I kept on my leather jacket, he looked me up and down and made a face. The Ramones are dead, you know. Not Marky or CJ. Who's CJ? The emergency backup Ramone. You getting me that drink? Griffin ordered my whiskey along with an expensive bottle of Pinot Noir. When the drinks came, he sipped his wine. After a moment, he leaned across the table and lowered his voice. Have you ever heard of a book called Picatrix? I shook my head. What is it? The most influential text on magic ever written. The most influential one known to exist, anyway. It dates to the 10th or 11th century, but it was probably written much earlier, somewhere in the Middle East. The English translation of the title is The Goal of the Wise, but no one knew of an extant copy of an edition in the original Arabic until 1920. Sometime around 1256, it was translated into Spanish, and a century or two later into Latin. So what does it mean, Picatrix? No one really knows. Could be a transcription error or a translation error. Some scholars speculate the author was a man named al-Mazriti. His first name can be roughly translated as to sting, which is similar to the medieval Latin word picere, which means to prick. There's a famous passage in Picatrix about treating a man for a scorpion sting with a tincture made of frankincense and the use of various talismanic seals. The book is filled with stuff like that. Whoever wrote it compiled this information from hundreds of other texts on magic, everything that was known in the ancient world. It's a cross between an encyclopedia and a user's manual for astrology, talismanic charms, spells, potions, obscure methods of torture and healing, you name it. Some of its ideas were later incorporated into Gnosticism and the scientific method and alchemy, and it was one of the earliest and most notorious banned books. The Inquisition arrested Casanova for owning a copy. Griffin took a gulp of his wine. His face had grown flushed. And, I mean, he went on, there are really good reasons for this being a banned book. In one section, you get this detailed description of how you lure a man into a temple, then strip him and imprison him in a gigantic pot full of sesame oil up to his neck. You feed him nothing but dried figs, no water, and wave incense around him for 40 days. By then, he becomes as flexible as a candle. I grimaced. Oh, nice. Oh, it gets better. After 40 days, you remove the head, hang it up, and wave around some more incense, and it talks to you. Gives you information on the stock market, political uprisings, the arrival of merchant ships. It also reminds you of when you need to offer a sacrifice to the temple and answers any questions you might have. It's the prototype for Siri. Griffin laughed. Picatrix is full of stuff like that. So what? You got a copy of this book? No, better. The waiter came to clear our plates. Without asking me, Griffin ordered 2 armagnacs. I was starting to wonder if he was going off the deep end. In book 3 of Picatrix, there's a single reference to something called the Book of Lamps and Banners. It's an even more ancient and arcane work, rumored to have been written by Aristotle for his student, Alexander the Great. Aristotle supposedly illustrated it, and there were handwritten notes to Alexander as well, and references to other people Aristotle knew. Eudamus, Plato. You're kidding me. Griffin shook his head. So why haven't I ever heard of this? Why hasn't anyone ever heard of this? Because this sounds like Dan Brown on really good acid. Because no copy was known to exist. He reached down for his leather messenger bag and pulled it onto his lap. One hand rested protectively on the bag's handle, the other his snifter of Armagnac. Until now, he said, and raised his glass to me. So that is the 2 of them in the restaurant, and they leave and they go take a cab to Hampstead, a short distance away in North London, where they go to Harold Vertigan's bookshop, which is in his home. And Harold, who's a very nice guy, lets them in and he shows them into the living room. And Griffin proceeds to produce, as you will see, the product he's going to sell. Griffin opened the battered leather satchel and withdrew a plastic shopping bag. Inside was a brown paper bag and inside that, a large green and white bag that had once held several pounds of Starbucks Cafe Verona, but now contained a number of Ziploc bags, one inside the other. Griffin opened each of these with the care and precision I associated with cocaine dealers in Alphabet City, circa 1983. At last, he withdrew a small object wrapped in rust-colored cloth. Painstakingly, he removed the cloth, revealing a book the size of a trade paperback. An unprepossessing volume, half-bound in leather, its dilapidated covers held together with twine. For a long moment, he stared at it, his expression at once avid and utterly forlorn, as though he gazed into the face of a lover he was bidding farewell during wartime. With a sigh, he turned and handed the book to Harold. "There you go," Griffin said. Harold placed the book on the low table in front of him. For almost a minute, he gazed at it, rubbing his chin. Finally, he reached into a pocket of his seersucker jacket and withdrew a pair of white cotton gloves. He pulled them on and undid the twine, gingerly grasped one leather board and opened the book. Reaching into another pocket, he withdrew a magnifying glass. He leaned over the volume, examining the end papers. "Whoever rebound this did a very good job," he said. 2,000-year-old papyrus is tough to match. They must have found some in an Egyptian sarcophagus for the end papers and frontispiece. That's one thing the Victorians were good for, stealing things from other people and putting them to their own use. Griffin seemed to relax. "Oh, that's what I thought," he said, and sat next to Harold. I squeezed in beside Griffin. "So this belonged to a Victorian collector?" "Among others," replied Harold, still peering through the magnifying lens. "Probably many, many others. If this volume is authentic, it would have been valuable even when it was first written. Aristotle and Alexander were rather well known in their own lifetimes. My guess is that it was in private hands after Aristotle's death, and then in a library, probably the library at Alexandria, until Julius Caesar burned it down." "So someone saved this one book?" Harold shrugged. "Many people may have saved many books, though not enough of them. The library at Alexandria was burned more than once, by Romans, by Coptic Christians, by Muslims. This..." He set down the magnifier to hold the volume in both hands, raising it toward us like an offering. "This was probably passed down from one scholar to another, or stolen from one by another for hundreds of years, thousands. At some point, it fell into the hands of a 19th century English antiquarian who took it upon himself to rebind it, thus the somber black Morocco binding." Harold stopped to eye my brimming champagne glass with mild dismay. Would you mind terribly?" "Sorry." I set the glass aside. I waited for Harold to say something, but he had once again picked up the magnifying glass and was now poring over the book's cover. Eyes widening, he turned to Griffin. "The binding's not Morocco. It's anthropodermic. Did you know that?" Griffin shook his head. "Jesus, no. No, just as well. Bad enough you brought this into the country in your hand luggage." I frowned. "What's anthropodermic?" "Human skin," said Harold. "It's not exactly common, but there are quite a few in private collections in university libraries. 1 or 2 medieval Bibles, and it seems to have been popular among anatomists going back to the 16th century. After the French Revolution, copies of the French Constitution were bound in the skins of aristocrats. Then there are the murderers. After they were hanged here in England, the cadavers of several convicted men were used to bind accounts of their trials." I pointed at the book. "Any idea who that might be?" Harold's mouth twisted into a wry smile. "I'll leave the carbon dating and DNA test to Tindra." Tindra is the end buyer who's going to purchase this for a huge amount of money. That might tell us more about how old it is. Some of your more gruesome Victorians went in for that sort of thing, like Richard Burton and his friends in the Cannibal Club. But this binding could be much, much older. He rested one gloved hand gently on the cover. This is a very advanced philosophical artifact, and I can guarantee you that some of the people who've owned it over the years knew exactly what it was. He turned several pages, all blank, before halting at what appeared to be a title sheet. Harold sucked his breath in, and I felt my skin prickle. The page was biscuit-colored, its deckled edge darker. It appeared thick and soft to the touch, like heavy silk. Feathery Arabic calligraphy covered the page, as well as Greek letters. At the top was a delicate rendering of hares leaping over 3 scarlet candles, each alight with a minute flame that must have been drawn with a single filament of sable. 7 circles of varying sizes and colors hung above the hare's long ears. Red and indigo, watery yellow, a lovely fresh violet. Be careful! Harold placed a hand on my arm. Without realizing it, I had bent my head to within inches of the page. I stared at him, and then at Griffin, and knew that each of our astonished faces mirrored the others. Extraordinary, murmured Harold. He turned to the next page, Greek words scrawled alongside a column of Arabic. The page following was crowded with esoteric symbols and another illustration. These pages are parchment, not papyrus, said Harold. It looks as though they were bound into the original manuscript. They're in Arabic with Greek annotations, which might make this the oldest example of an illustrated Arabic text on top of everything else. Oh dear. A loose page protruded from between the others. Delicately, Harold pinched it between his fingers and gazed at it. I could see lines of text that resembled bird tracks, but no illustrations. What is it? Anxiety crept into Griffin's voice. Is it damaged? Oh, no, nothing like that, Harold replied with a reassuring look. It's part of the original Arabic text, I think. He turned the sheet to peruse the other side. Brightly colored images covered the page now facing me, with a single line of written text across the top. Incredibly tiny words, like black ants marching across the page. Only these words weren't in Arabic or Greek, but Old English. I leaned closer so that I could read them. He that doth profess such desire as to see the devil must seek him here and no further. Good heavens, Harold murmured, still scrutinizing the bird scratchings on the other side. These are runes. I shook my head. Runes? I think so. It looks like an early form of the writing used by some ancient Germanic tribes, which is remarkable because the rest of this is an Arabic book. Except for the tipped-in pages, it's made of conjugate bifolia, 5 folded sheets that when cut would result in 20 pages. Arabic books were usually made from groups of conjugate bifolio bound together, but sometimes a leaf comes loose, and I think that's what's happened here. Most of the time, the missing page is lost. He turned back to the volume on the table, his brow furrowing. Yes, the other pages in this section are all illuminated, which means that this one is detached from bifolio bound elsewhere in the volume. Do you know what it says? I can make out a bit. I sold a fragment of a 9th century Bible once from Iceland, one of the only examples we have of a biblical text transcribed in runes. He squinted at the leaf. Angar's work. Beware, this is power. I think the rest is some kind of formula, perhaps for metalworking, or maybe not, he added, and touched one of the runes with a gloved finger. This doesn't look like ink, but blood. So, a spell? Spectrographic analysis will sort that out. God knows. They might even be able to run DNA tests on it. He sank back onto the couch, looking faintly shell-shocked. Do you know what this means? It establishes a link between the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean and the far north, centuries before anyone thought that existed. It's unbelievable. He turned to Griffin. This is it, he said, and reverently set the loose-leaf book back where he found it. The Book of Lamps and Banners. I would stake my life on it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I think this has been a pretty crazy week. And so to have such a good reading on a Friday night is just fantastic. All right, I have a few audience questions if you're ready.
Sure.
First of all, this is from David Rogers, and he wanted to know which Cass story was the hardest to write and which was the most fun?
Oh, great question, David. I would say that the first one, Generation Loss, was definitely the hardest to write because I had never written a noir novel before, a quote, mainstream novel that ostensibly has no element of the fantastic in it, even though there is a tiny one, sort of little Easter eggs throughout the series, if you know where to look. So that was definitely the hardest. And I would say, in some ways, Available Dark, the second book, was a lot of fun to write, only because it was so bonkers and it dealt with the black metal scene in Iceland and kind of the background of the Norwegian black metal murders that took place in Scandinavia in the 80s and 90s. And so that was kind of fun in parts. But Hard Light I liked a lot, the third book, because I'm kind of an archaeology geek and a geek about ancient ruins and things in England, and that was in there. And this book was fun to write because I'm also obviously a bibliophile and a book geek, like probably many of us here. And so I got to do a lot of research into ancient manuscripts with the help of my partner, who's a big book collector, and a number of my friends who are book collectors. And my friend Henry Wessels, who's an antiquarian book collector and very knowledgeable, and helped me a great deal. And I did a lot of, did some research in London at the Wellcome Library, where I got to handle Incunabula and got to handle a book with anthropodermic binding, which was really creepy. So yeah, there's lots of fun. There's lots of cool stuff in all of them. The only one that was definitely, I found a challenge, just because it was dark on so many levels, was Generation Loss. So that one was hard.
Yeah, I actually, I have a question about your writing process, and so does Kathleen from the audience. So you mentioned, you have a lot of people who you can help as resources. Where did you start your research process? Did you know where you were going when you began? And then was there something that you found during that you wanted to include it and maybe didn't make it, or that you were just fascinated by but maybe wasn't the right fit for this book?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I love research. I would very happily, if I could be paid to like research novel after novel and after novel and never have to actually write the novel, that would be kind of my idea of heaven, because I love doing research. I love falling down the rabbit holes. I love like going to places and talking to people. And I love learning things. I have a kind of a low boredom threshold. So with every book, I try to have something about it that I don't know anything about, or something I might know a little bit about, and I get to learn more. And so with this book, what I learned a lot more about was ancient texts and having, I mean, I know a lot of book collectors and have known them for many years. So I was able to draw on their knowledge for a lot of this. And as far as stuff that like ended up on the cutting room floor, there was one passage which is still in the book, although it's in a shorter version. My partner in London has been collecting books, for decades. And he, since the 1960s and early 70s, has been collecting books there, and actually used to sell books at a book market in North London. And he told me what it was like back then, 40 years ago, and back when there was just like, something like 100 bookstores and bookstalls that you would see every week or every day in London, and now they're all gone. And so I put some of that into the book, and I would have loved to have included more of that, because it was just so, it was so visceral, and it's this lost world. It was kind of a link almost with the Victorian era, even before that, with the early, 1900s. And up until fairly recently, the 1980s, it was there, and now it's gone. But that was a passage that was just kind of, it was like a flashback sort of thing. And there is some of it in here. There's a bit of it left. But yeah, but I was sorry I couldn't include more about just the book trade, which is really interesting and kind of seedy and kind of exciting.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it fits in with the kind of noir Cass's.
Yeah, exactly.
More underground tastes. Speaking of that, you mentioned that she's kind of an aging punk. Has music influenced your writing with her at all? Or do you have maybe like a punk playlist you go to when thinking about these books?
Yeah, I have a bunch of, I make a playlist for every book, and they definitely, a lot of the same songs and playlists keep showing up again and again and again. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of, punk stuff, kind of early first wave proto-punk and very early 1970s, For me, like Cass, punk kind of ended in 1977.
Right.
It's been all downhill ever since. But but no, I have my listening tastes are actually very broad. So I listen to like all kinds of stuff, and I'm lucky in that a lot of my friends in the real world and at conferences and conventions and on social media are really geek, they're like me, they're music geeks. So they're always turning me on to new stuff or obscure stuff. So a lot of that goes into the mix. And I do create playlists for individual books. But a lot of the same stuff, because it's the same character and same central characters, a lot of the same music tends to get carried over with then more stuff added into the mix.
Right. This one is from Becky, and speaking about Cass, how did it feel to come back to Cass after a break from her, or time away from her, I guess?
It feels good, I have to say. It's always, I finish one of the Cass novels, and finishing any novel is always exhausting. And sometimes finishing her novels are really exhausting, because she is often in extremis, in extremis. She's an alcoholic, she's a drug addict, she doesn't eat enough, she doesn't sleep enough, and she's always wired. And obviously I'm not any of those things, or I couldn't function, I couldn't write the books. But I'm in that head and having to write about that head all the time. And it is draining, to have to be basically thinking about what it's like to be an addict all the time. And it's not a good place to be. I know I've had friends, people close to me who have had some of the same issues that she has. And, some of them are dead now because of them. And most of them are alive and sober and cleaned up, but it's a painful thing to witness. And so it is kind of, it is very draining to be in, writing from that space. And this book in particular, I have to say, at the end, it was really kind of felt like a death march in a lot of ways. I won't say more than that, but anyway, so yeah, it's kind of a relief to finish the book, but then it's fun to get back into the head again, because I'm very familiar with her and how she moves about the world. And so it's kind of like, running into a friend that you may not necessarily want to be like going away for 2 weeks vacation with, but it's okay to like, hang out for a night and stay up late all night drinking and talking. And then like, early in the morning, you're like, okay, goodbye, push her out the door. So yeah.
I think it's probably tricky enough to plan a character arc over a single book. How does that shift when writing a series? Does it shift or is it just kind of extended?
Yeah, it definitely is extended. When I wrote the first book, I was not aware at that time that I would write a series, and that was really a grueling experience. And when it was done, I was like, I never wanted to write another book like that again. And then about a year or two later, I gave a reading in New York City, and an editor came up to me and said, "Oh my God, that was wonderful." It was a reading from Generation Law. She was like, "Oh, that was wonderful. Would you do that again?" And I was like, well, okay. So that was when I wrote Available Dark. And at that point I thought, okay, if I'm doing this, I should probably be thinking about doing more of them, because editors always say, they want you to write a character where you can get traction and kind of, build readers over a series. So I thought, okay, I'm going to stick with this character for a while. I've written other books in between. So, I've take a break and write 1 or 2 novels in between. But I did realize that there was going to have to be an arc, that she was going to have to change over time, which she does, because otherwise it's very boring. It's very boring, for me to write that. And I think it would be very boring for readers to read it. If she doesn't change somewhat, psychologically over the course of time, people are going to lose interest in her. I'm going to lose interest in her, even if you're not. But I think readers would as well. So yeah, so she definitely changes, and if you read this book, you'll see what happens at the end. And I'm hoping, that there'll be at least one more. So
are we. Maybe more. You mentioned that this is kind of a grueling march at the end. A question from Minal in the audience: is it harder to write dark material, not the Philip Pullman book, when things in the world are so grim, or is it cathartic, or something else entirely?
Oh, that is a really good question, Minal. Yeah, it is. Well, with this particular book, because I was working on this book in 2016, and Brexit happened, and then the election happened, and it was, all of a sudden this book which was a very dark book to begin with, I had already been, because it's set in London, I was having to rewrite things to keep up with what was going on there with Brexit. And then the election here happened, and that dovetailed with the rise of white nationalists and white supremacists, which already played a role in the Book of Lamps and Banners. And if she had happened to be in the US at the time, it would have been set here. But because she was in the UK, I dealt with the rise of white nationalists and extremists there, and then also in Sweden. And so, yeah, it was definitely very hard. And I spoke to people. I talked to some people who are, experts in white nationalists, and in the U.S. and in Europe, and that's a very dark place to go to talk to them. This is their expertise is in how do we recognize these cells, because in places they do operate as cells, like terrorists do. So it was definitely, having to feed myself a lot of information, in addition to the information that I was being fed by, waking up every day and reading the news, or, walking outside and seeing what was going on, outside my door if I was in London or at home here. So I think it is cathartic in the sense that I control what's going to happen. And I personally don't like white supremacists, and neither does Cass. And, she's got a much worse temper than I do. So, so there are
rashness out of the
yeah. So there's definitely, there's definitely, moments of catharsis there that I enjoyed writing. But that's been true, you know, with all the books. The books are very political. They have a you know, there are stories, but they reflect the world that we live in, and so they do reflect things like the changes that are going on here and abroad, and they do reflect things like climate change, and violence against women, and violence against, you know, LGBTQ, you know, queer characters, people of color, Black people, ethnic and racial violence, you know, all of these things kind of go into the mix. But the advantage of being an author and writing fiction is that I can exert some control as to how it turns out. So
that makes complete sense.
I wish I could do that in the real world.
Just put on the puppet strings and just get everything right back in order. This is a little bit of a shift in topic, but Jean in the audience wanted to know what drew you to the Arabic or Icelandic link, and that it's very exciting and makes an, you know, enormous sense because they're voyagers. But what was the draw there?
Well, the Book of Lamps and Banners, the book Picatrix, which Griffin refers to, that is an actual book of magic that does exist. And I came across that, I think when I was researching Available Dark, which is set in Iceland. And Picatrix, which is an Arabic book, I read it, and I mean, in English translation, obviously, but there was a single reference in it to something called the Book of Lamps and Banners. And this was maybe, you know, this is some years ago. And at that time, I filed it away in my head. I was like, this is a great title. I'm going to make use of that. Right. And the connection between, you know, the Arabic world and places like Iceland or Scandinavia is, as you said, they are voyagers. There was this crossover, you know, that we are finding out more and more about this, you know, all the time. So although the stuff that I, you know, from the section I read here, you know, because the Book of Lamps and Banners, it did exist. Right. And it was rumored to have been written by Aristotle for Alexandria the Great. That is true. But no copy of it has ever been found. So I made up all of that stuff, basically. But there was definitely contact between the northern world and the Arabic world and the Mediterranean. Those trade routes did exist. Gotland in Sweden, which plays a role in the Book of Lamps and Banners. That was a big place for traders. So going back to the Middle Ages. So there was a lot of trade going on then. There was a lot of trade between the Arabic world and the Mediterranean world. So that all kind of got dumped into the mix.
That makes sense, yeah. I actually have a question from Annie. Maine is most definitely a character in your books. When did you move to Maine and what inspires you about it?
I moved to Maine in 1988, and I love it. When I was a kid, when, you know, we would go, my family, my parents, hi Mom and Dad, and my brothers and sisters and we would all go camping. We would take camping trips to Maine and to the Maritimes in Canada. And then when we got a bit older, we would rent lakeside cottages, camps in Maine. And then when I was in my 20s, one of my good friends from college was from here, and she got married up here. Her family had a place on Vinyl Haven. So I went there in like 1984, and I just fell in love with it and made a subsequent trip up there. A whole bunch of us came up there and stayed at her place. And I just fell in love with Maine. And it's a very beautiful place, but it's very stark. And, you know, I talk about it in Generation Loss, which is set in Maine, about how, you know, people, you come here with this sort of vision of what it's going to be like, this sort of cottaging, rustic core lifestyle, which I had in my head when I moved here 32 years ago. And I moved here early in October, and like a month later, I had that kicked out of me in a hurry. I was like, oh my God, this is like, what have I done? But I stayed, you know, and I loved it. And I loved the bleak parts too. There's a line in I think it's in generation loss, or maybe, you know, maybe it's an available dark. I think it's a generation loss, when she's talking about, you know, all the bleak shit that I love. And she's talking about, because she's a photographer, she's talking about the quality of the light. And Maine has amazing light, especially this time of year. You know, as we get to fall and winter, you just get this beautiful stark light, and just the contrast, you know, there's it's a really interesting place. You know, it has great physical beauty, but there's, you know, it has a lot of the same serious, social issues that we face anywhere. You know, there's a lot of income disparity. There's a great divide between the haves and the have-nots, between, you know, people who live on the coast of Maine and southern Maine, and the rest of the state, which when I first moved here and people referred to that, they said, yeah, well, you haven't been to the real Maine. Just, you know, you're living here in the mid-coast, and this is not the real Maine. If you go 10 miles inland, you'll start to get to the real Maine, or if you go down east, you'll start to see it. Yeah, and I remember going with my then partner, Richard, and my kid's dad, and he and I took a road trip right after we moved. He and I moved to Maine together in '88, and in November we had this little Volkswagen Bug, and we drove down east, and I felt like we were driving off the end of the earth. Right. And I mean, I really did. So, and this is, you know, 32 years ago, so Maine was different then, and even bleaker and more remote. But I can recall at one point looking out the window, and we're driving by this barn, and I thought that they had like hung up at first I thought they were deer, like 8 or 10 deer. And then I thought, are those German shepherds? And then I realized there were like all these coyotes that were hanging on the side of the barn, because at the time there was a bounty on coyotes. Right. And I was like, whoa, this is not, I'm not living on Capitol Hill anymore.
Yeah. Oh, I think Annie has a question.
I was just saying you were not in Kansas anymore. And
that
is exactly like that. Thank you. That was the kind of, I love that you said it's beautiful, but stark, and that is just perfect. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for answering the question.
I think too, as a New York expat who moved here, you know, you can walk out in the winter and it's totally still and quiet, but for me that's so unsettling. So I have to have like loud music or something bustling to make me feel like it's not a zombie apocalypse or something like that. I have 2 more quick questions. One is from Megan in the audience. As a bibliophile, what book would you add to your collection if availability and price were not an obstacle?
Oh, wow.
That's an easy one. Softball.
Yeah, that's an easy one. You know, I would go for one of those first folios of Shakespeare. Yeah. I would definitely go for one of those. My friend Henry, who works at an antiquarian bookstore, and he had, it was not a first folio, but it was one of those really early, you know, like a first folio, Shakespeare, and he showed it to me, and I got to see it and touch it, and it was amazing. I mean, and I got to like turn to, you know, Twelfth Night, my favorite play, and I mean, that was incredible. So yeah, I think I would probably go for that. I know that seems like an easy answer, but that's probably genuinely what I would do. Yeah. So maybe I'll start like a GoFundMe page.
Let me just get this one book.
Just get this one book. It's only one book.
Yeah, exactly. We just have one more question come in that I'm curious of the answer about, from Emily. Can you talk about your writing routine, morning, night, word count, how many drafts before you show it to anyone? And then when do you sit and read your book? And I think too, has this changed during quarantine? Is it, I don't know, more accessible, less accessible?
Yeah. Hi, Emily. Well, I try to work every day. That's in theory. In fact, I have been, you know, really not productive during the pandemic. I was working on something and I just kept trying. I got several hundred pages done, but they were not good. So I just had to keep throwing it out. under ideal circumstances, I work every day and I work in the morning. You know, I get up and I will work intensely for a few hours. When I'm able to really work, again, under ideal circumstances, I will work in the morning. I'll take a break for a few hours, then I'll work again in the afternoon. My average is usually about 1,000 words a day. So that's what I try to do. I try to sit down, I try to write my 1,000 words a day. If I'm really burning on something, I'll take a break, I'll come back and write another 1,000 words. And that's great when that happens. During the pandemic, no, it just early on, it was just too stressful and worrying about family, worrying about my students, worrying about my friends. It was just really hard to focus. And it was just, things were just getting broken up a lot. And so I'm hoping, when I get back to Maine next week, I'm hoping to kind of, knuckle down and get back into writing again with a new book, a different book. I decided the book I was working on, just wasn't working. I read Eileen Miles's Chelsea Girls not long ago, and which I tried to read and couldn't get into. And this time I enjoyed it. But she had a great line in there, and she said something about, you know what, it's like, life is too short to write something you don't love. Words to that effect. She said it more eloquently than that, but that was pretty much it. And I thought, you're right. And this book that I've been bashing my head against for like months, I don't love it. No one else is going to love it. I do have an idea that I think I love, that I think will also be good. So I'm going to go to that. But yeah, it's been tough. And I think you also just have to kind of, be forgiving of yourself if things aren't working. And I sit down and reread my stuff constantly, and I'm constantly rewriting it, which is how I know when something is not working. If I might be able to fool myself with a first draft of something, thinking that it's really great. And by a first draft, I don't mean a finished book. I mean a first draft of a chapter or a page or whatever. But then when I go back and reread it, and I'm like, no, I know this is not good. So, yeah.
There's
but
a great,
you can always go back again.
Yeah, there's a great, I cannot tell you where it's from, but I think it's a Colson Whitehead quote where it's something along the lines of like, you are the only you that can write that sentence. So just write that sentence, no one else is going to put it on the page.
Right.
Love that.
I think. Okay, so you mentioned Eileen Miles. What is one of your favorite books you've read this year? It's my final question, I promise, but I won't keep you all night.
Oh man, this is so hard because there have been books that I've read this year that I love, but now I can't think of what any of them are. What did I was reading something.
Can I help give you an out?
I'm sorry?
Can I give you an out too? Maybe like it's not necessarily a book, but maybe like an amazing essay.
Well, I've been reading some Louise Erdrich, who I really love, and when I've come to visit my folks a few times, and my mom had several of her books here, and I picked them up and read them, and I love those. The Plague of Doves, that was one of the books that I read that I really loved. I reviewed some really great books this year. The problem is I read so much for doing book reviews and also reading student manuscripts, and reading for pleasure tends to kind of fall by the wayside, and so that's the stuff I can never remember. But I did love The Plague of Doves. I'm reading Joe Hill's book right now, The Only Good Indians, which is really dark, but it's really, really good. I read a novel by Sylvia Garcia Moreno, which was a good book. She wrote Mexican Gothic, but this was a noir novel called Untamed Shore, which was really cool. And a debut collection of short stories by Usman Malik called Midnight Doorways, Fables from Pakistan. And he is a Pakistani American writer who writes very literary horror, and just an outstanding book. Shira Palmer's Orm Shadow, that was another really good book. There's a lot of books. If I was at home, I would be able to look around and see the stacks of them, like on the floor everywhere.
That's amazing.
But
I know I sometimes get stuck when people say that to me, because I do sometimes, particularly in moments like this where there's a lot of things happening, and where like the most time I have is just for essays or a New Yorker article, and people say like, what are you reading? And I'm like, and I get things, but sometimes it's a short essay, or it's just a, you know, it's a talk of the town or something that just, so anyway, that's why I was that's why I was throwing it to you, just to say like it might not.
Yeah, throw me a bone, throw me a line.
Yeah,
yeah.
Those are wonderful
A Ruth Rendell book. I just read something by
Oh.
Ruth Rendell too. I love her, called Tiger Lily's Orchids. She's such a great, you know, she's like Kate Atkinson. She's one of these people who writes crime novels, but they're just kind of like, they're just such cool books. They're not really crime novels at all. They're such beautiful character studies.
Alrighty. I think that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much for reading and taking our minds off of nonsense and just having a great time.
So good.
Again, we have plenty of copies at print. Feel free to head on over there and pick up yours. We have shipping and curbside pickup. And yeah, just thank you again for virtually coming out tonight.
Thank you so much, both of you, Gracie and Annie. Thank you, everybody who's out there. I couldn't see everybody who is here. I'm looking now quickly. I see Emily, Mina. This is Mina. Yes, I'm seeing. Oh, Cliff. Hi, Cliff. Kathleen, Mary Beth. Oh, see, I'm seeing different people here. So, anyway, so cool to see you all in the virtual world, and thank you all so much. Thank you for doing this. So,
thank you, everyone. All right,
Thanks.
have a great night.
Okay.
Night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.